Hey everyone, today on the BodCast I am talking with my friend and third-time guest, John Sharkey. You might remember that John has been on the show twice before where he talked about biotensegrity and all things fascia wonderful. Today, we're switching gears a little bit and John is talking about consciousness. This is a fun conversation full of smiles and tangents, but it is a fun conversation and it kind of just gets the brain going on, well, what is consciousness and, well, where does it come from? And is it only in us or is it everywhere else? Anyway, I love talking with John. He is so full of just light and energy and he smiles so much you just feel good talking to him. And you can hear the smile in his voice. So guys, pull up a chair, buckle up, enjoy this fun, smile-filled conversation between two friends about consciousness. Pull up a chair and buckle up. It's the Original Strength Podcast.
Good seeing you, man. How are you doing? You good?
Yes, sir. How you've been doing good as well?
Hanging in there. I mean, I have to say that, there's all sorts of difficulties, isn't there, with regards to us getting on with life following COVID. And then we still have Putin, as they say in the UK, playing silly buggers, they say. He's, just trying to work up a little bit of a storm there and try to get other countries involved. And we'll see what happens. I mean, we've got China, facing up to the USA and shaping up to see what they're going to do, so there's a lot of dynamic going on, and I think it's what it does is it interferes with people's confidence. What do you think?
I totally agree. Like, to me, it's just crazy. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know. I struggle with, and I guess everybody's not the same, but like, why can't we like be kind to each other and like see a bigger picture? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't
There
know.
are so many who feel that way, and yet historically, there are many examples where human beings have in many ways let ourselves down. We've behaved in atrocious ways, and World War II, and you look back at how people in Germany, people in France, and people in even the Irish, the Polish, how they behaved. So not just one country; it's several countries, who were implicit in much of the activity. I often stop and think, I know we're going to talk about consciousness today, which takes us into morals and ethics. So you wonder about that. You wonder, how would you have behaved? If you were living in those times, would you have been brave enough to stand up to say, no, that this is wrong? So I don't know, we're frail at times, human beings. And then you've got others who, Nelson Mandela, as a great example, perfect example, gave up so much of his entire life, in that little small jail cell, believing in people and then not wanting to get revenge on the individuals when he came out. Oh.
It's wild. And I often think, like, because you're like, well, how would you have behaved in that time or in that situation? So I think about stuff like that. And like, everybody, like, if you're at war, like, and I heard a statistic that throughout human history, 93% of the time we've been at war since,
Right.
like, which is crazy. But the thing is like whatever you're fighting for, you believe, I'm assuming, that you're on the right side, that or the good side. Because why else would you be fighting? I don't know. It's just weird.
Well, again, today our intention was to have a conversation about consciousness. And when you think about from an evolutionary viewpoint, for the listeners, whoever is listening, and whatever your belief systems are, from a Darwinian viewpoint, from an evolutionary viewpoint, you watch the primates and you see that the primates would have wars with other primates that were living in close proximity, and the idea would be to take over new territory, and to be able to pass on their genes, and they, we share, that DNA. and that is part of our evolutionary history, but we have consciousness. And consciousness then empowers us. So if you were in a court of law, they would want to ask the case, was this premeditated, as opposed to it just, happen on the spur of the moment. And of course, the premeditation brings in consciousness. The premeditated aspect of it says, did you stop and think about it? And did you, weigh up the scenario, just knowing that it was ethically and morally wrong, and you still went ahead with it, you see? And that would be the question then, where people would ask, well, do primates have consciousness, or if they do they have the same level of consciousness? And so on. So in other words, what I'm saying there, to some extent, is that you can't kind of use the evolutionary argument to kind of forgive us for acting bad, because we're in a different place in evolution, and we have this great utility, this great facility of consciousness, which allows you to recognize right from wrong, and therefore to be able to make your decisions, good decisions, hopefully. But there we go. I might mention his name more than once, Ian McGilchrist, who wrote how these guys write these books, by the way. Ian McGilchrist has written this. Do I have his book here beside me? Just one second. I think I have his book over here. And now I do my best. I don't want anybody to get the impression that, I'm somehow incredibly brainy and clever because I might read a book like this. That's a big tome.
Oh gosh.
There's a lot of reading. There's really no diagrams in here, folks.
No pictures.
There's no pictures in here. That's not one of these type of books, and this is the master and his emissary. I mean, it's just quite incredible. And so therefore, I think what's happening to society is that we are becoming more left brain dominant, want, left brain grasp with the right hand. And perhaps we need to find a way back to, to new values or older values. Not quite sure what the answer to that is. But anyway, this is what happens with the conversation of consciousness. Yeah, it goes in so many different directions, and it really is the conversation of everything. It's the conversation about absolutely everything, But anyway, I don't know. How do you want to, how do you want to kick this off? Or
I think we've already kicked it.
All right, brilliant.
So. Help us understand, like what is your viewpoint of consciousness?
Oh wow, I mean, yeah, it's a difficult question to answer in terms of, well, where do we start? Because there are several ways that you could get into this. And by the way, what I didn't want to do was which is typical of me, I never want to try to kind of script something in my mind. I want it to be a little bit more organic and a bit more natural.
Awesome.
But anybody who knows me, therefore, knows that I go off on tangents. But then I will pull it back, to the kind of the central theme, etc. So where do you go with it? Well, consciousness, I would say, is thought to be epiphenomenal. It's an epiphenomenal illusion. In other words, a byproduct, if you will. And that determinism, in other words, our actions, the world around us, seem to be kind of algorithmic and inevitable. So it's almost like, like as if we're computers. But of course, the difference between, these are the big questions that you ask, the difference between ourselves and a computer would be, can a computer feel satisfaction when they complete a job? So, computers can do things, faster than we can, and probably more accurate in many cases than we can. But the question would be, does the computer feel any joy in having, achieved the particular result? So I think we need to take some steps in order to be able to really, get our head around what consciousness is. From my perspective, Tim, I'm a child of the 60s. I'm a 60s kid. And we were encouraged and influenced when we were growing up by the influences of our day. So who are the influences of our day? By the way, how old are you?
I'm 40. I'll be 48 soon.
Okay, so you're old enough to be able to remember a number of these guys as well. So, I would have looked to people like Carl Sagan, Arthur C. Clarke, 2001, and then 2010. The movies that Arthur C. Clarke was amazing. The TV series Star Trek, and I think that people of my age, and I think everybody really ponders the big questions: who are we? What is our place in the world, in the cosmos, the universe? The universe means, everything. And how did we get from cosmos to consciousness? And I think that, like so many of my own generation, I feel I was educated and inspired and motivated, by those minds and others. I mean, Albert Einstein, who was a theoretical physicist. I mentioned Carl Sagan. Let's call him, what would we call him? Call him a cosmologist, although he had, a lot more qualifications to his name than that. Richard Feynman. Would people know Richard Feynman?
I think so.
Yeah, theoretical physicist. He was the guy who discovered about the O-ring in the Space Shuttle Challenger when it exploded. He's the guy who brought that to light. And he was just an incredible character. You've got Irishman James Hamilton, who studied in Dublin. He was a theoretical physicist. Edwin Schrödinger, people may have heard of Schrödinger's cat. He was an Austrian who came here to Dublin because of the war, World War II. And he won the Nobel Prize with another individual, Paul Dirac, for Schrödinger's cat and for what's something called quantum superposition. We won't go into that today, but the point is, and I mentioned Ian McGilchrist and the master and his emissary. What else have I got? I've got another book here, which I'll show you, which is Yuval Noah Harari. He wrote this book called Sapiens. You've got Donald Hoffman, who's a cognitive psychologist, Roger Penrose, and Stuart Hameroff, whom I might mention a little bit later on. They're involved in, Roger Penrose is a mathematician. Stuart Hameroff is involved in quantum physics, all sorts of arguments for and against what these people are promoting. But you also have, for your listeners, philosopher Thomas Nagel. And he wrote a paper in 1974 where he was basically asking, what is it like to be? What does it feel like to be? An organism is conscious if there is something that it feels like to be that organism. This is what he says, and I think that many people quote Thomas Nagel when they're talking about consciousness. Now, there's others, maybe too many to mention, but let's see then if we can just put a little bit of a timeline on it, Tim. So, so somewhere in the region of 13.5 billion years ago, there was an event that we call the Big Bang. The Big Bang was a theory given to us by a Belgian priest by the name of Georges Lemaître. And this was in the early 30s. And then, so scientists believe that at that moment of the Big Bang, that time and space came into existence. Now, I just brought with me here also a Hoverman sphere. I don't know if you're familiar with this. And I use this for many different kind of examples. But when people say Big Bang, I wouldn't like people to get the idea that there was an explosion, and when you watch Discovery Channel, that's what you get that feeling that there was this big explosion, this Big Bang. It's not quite like that. It's more like this. I'm never quite sure where the camera is in this. Am I supposed to look there? Am I supposed to look here? I'm looking at you, you see.
I understand, but you're good right there. Anywhere you look is fine. Yeah.
Anyway, so but that is kind of like the Big Bang. In other words, if you can imagine, this was this infinitesimally small, thing. It was so small, and then it expanded. It did that. You see, and that's what Big Bang is. And so some people use different words, and these are all, of course, man-made words. But people might use words like inflation. So. Okay, so that's we'll say 13.5 billion years ago. Then something like, let me say, half a million years passed, in which time matter and energy then combined to fuse into atoms, and these were more complex constructs, of matter. These were, your simple bacteria. Later there was viruses. So now we had biology occurring on planet Earth with organisms based on physiology, metabolism, chemistry. So now we've life. So life either originated on Earth or it came to Earth. But one way or the other, I think we both agree that there is life. Okay, of course that would be one of the what we would call epistemological questions, which would really be, are we real? And is there life, and is there ontology would take us into the question of is there meaning to life? And so we can only have the first person experience. I feel that I'm alive, and I trust that you are, and I trust that your kids are, because I believe it, but we can't actually prove that beyond, reasonable doubt, believe it or not. This is part of one of the issues with regards to consciousness. So then, as I say, how does the evolution of Homo sapiens, or to give us our full term, by the way, Homo sapiens, which is too difficult to say, we'll just say Homo sapiens, right? So how does the evolution of Homo sapiens then fit into the timeline? How does the human brain, and by association its neural activity, fit into the story of consciousness at the gross or quantum level? And then how can we provide or offer some logical validity or evidence, if you will, an explanation that places consciousness in the theory of evolution specifically? So that's back to Charles Darwin's theory expressed in his seminal work on the origin of species. And we could ask, one of the questions would be, did Homo sapiens derive from consciousness, or does there need to be a specific benefit? Could consciousness simply arise as an emergent property? And that's partly what I actually believe, that consciousness arrives out of the complexity of matter over time. So consciousness is one of these weird things in terms of, it doesn't have a shape, it doesn't have specific size, it doesn't have any solidity to it. In other words, it's not solid, doesn't have a color or a smell. If you go to cognitive neuroscience, psychology, physics, anatomy, which of course I'm a clinical anatomist, philosophy, we've lots of correlations. But today, 21st century, we've no theory for experience. And I think I've done my best over my 62 years. I've done my best to try to kind of be judicial in the way I go about gathering information and coming up with theories. I was very interested, even as a young child, in religion, for example. Anybody who knows me, Tim, will know I don't have a religious bone in my body. But I have lots of friends who are religious, and I love that. And I think that's absolutely fantastic. And I don't have this kind of a stance where, they're absolutely wrong and I'm absolutely right. I just haven't seen the evidence. One of the things I have to say to you, by the way, and stop me at any stage, by the way, and feel free to ask a question. One of the things I've noticed about me over the years is that I discovered I had become institutionalized. In other words, doing degrees within the university settings, I had people say to me, oh, don't pay attention to those people. They're quacks. Now, I've got friends of mine, and none of them won't mind mentioning them in this regard, but one of my friends is James Oshman, and James has written a wonderful book called Energy Medicine. Now, I would have been encouraged not to listen to someone like James, and James is a cellular biologist. But then that took me into the conversation on energy. And what is energy? So we look at a current bun. And how would we describe a current bun in terms of energy? We would say, I don't know if you want to have a bash at answering that question or not, but what's a current bun? Well, it would be, I'm useless when people ask me questions. Put questions. I'm usually the one asking the questions, and when it gets reversed, but a current bun could be described as potential energy. In other words, we have flour, butter, sugar. I don't know what you put into a current bun. It just goes to show you how domestic I am. I've never made one, but so your flour, sugar, butter, milk product, and you have to put it into the oven, of course. But there's potential energy in that current bun. Now, we hold it in our hands and we start to pull it apart. So now we're breaking apart the energy bonds that held it together. So energy holds the current bond together. Okay, well, what is energy? Well, we know that we can eat the current bond. So we start using our teeth and saliva and digestive enzymes and hydrochloric acid in our stomach. And we break down and dissolve that current bond into a liquid form that can then be released out by the gastrointestinal tract, can be released out into the body, and the body then can take it down to the cellular level, and it provides the cell with energy. Okay, what's the energy? Well, it's this thing called adenosine triphosphate, right? What is that? Well, it's a chemical, and it has energy potential in it. All right, so we can do work. We can do work with it, and it produces heats, and it produces heat. Okay, so what is it? What is energy? I have no idea what energy is. You know, we'll keep going further down the rabbit hole. Same thing happens with consciousness. So for me, as starting out, as I said, I was interested as a young boy in religions. My mother would not have entertained this, by the way, but in Dublin, in Ireland, we had Mormons, and they were just the most incredible people, the most incredible characters. A bit like you there, Tim. They had the short hair, you know, really that crew cut. They had these white, stiffly, starched shirts, with the pleated trousers. They just looked absolutely amazing. As I got older and started to watch Kevin Costner in movies, I was kind of thinking that's what they were like. They were all like Kevin Costner's, the all-American, apple pie. They looked fantastic, and I was intrigued by them. And myself and my brother actually invited them out to our house when my mother wasn't in. She wasn't home. And we wanted to hear what they had to tell us, because we'd grown up in a Catholic home, and so we knew about Catholicism. But we wanted to know about other religions, just to hear, because there are, at any one time, we've had about 10,000 religions on the earth, and, if you speak to somebody of a religious bent, you would say, well, only one religion is right, and all 9,999 are wrong. So therefore, everybody else is just one step away from where I am in that regard. But that's also called faith, by the way, and I think that's great. I think that's fantastic that people have faith. And my mother did. My mother was very, very, she was very, very religious, and I kind of envied certain aspects of that. But anyway, these guys came to our home, and they started talking to us about the Mormon religion and the history of it and what happened. I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. I couldn't believe that they believed, the stories behind, this particular religion. I just found it really, really, to be unbelievable. And then as I became an adult, started studying anatomy, I started asking myself the question, so what would happen if you were to cut off a big toe? How would I feel the world? How would I experience the world? And what happened if I cut off a foot, or if I cut off an entire, both of my lower limbs? I'd experience the world differently. I'd have a different sense of the world, but I'd still have consciousness. So what if we take both of my upper limbs off? Would I still have consciousness? Yes. Okay, so at what point when do I reach a stage where I cut something off in the human body and I lose consciousness? I don't have consciousness anymore. And it turns out, in fact, that there is a particular part of the brain. I should have brought a brain in with me. There's a particular portion of the brain. It's the brain stem. And if that portion of the brain stem, the reticular extended thalamic activating system, it's a bit of a mouthful. And if that portion of the brain gets damaged, then you become comatose. So you lose all consciousness. Now, we could still keep you alive, and you'd still be metabolic, and you still have all the physiology going on in your body, but you would be, for all intents and purposes, you're dead, but still breathing. Or you're certainly, that's not true, you're alive and still breathing, but you don't have any conscious experience. So that's basically what I was doing when I first started out. I was trying to see, could I find, somewhere in the human body that I could find consciousness? And that's where you find it. That's exactly where consciousness is. Now, what about all the other stuff then? How does that play a role? And I think it feeds into it's a feedback system that feeds into consciousness. But that's where consciousness is in the body. And I don't know, have I done justice now to giving you some kind of a sense of what I think consciousness is? Consciousness is the observer. Consciousness allows me to observe. So if you were to smell a cup of coffee, can you imagine what that would smell like? Can you imagine what the color red would be like? But we can find correlates. We can see little sections of your brain lighting up. Neurophysiologists and others could do that. They can look at brains in fMRIs and other equipment, and we can see various parts of the brain lighting up. But you can't. That in itself doesn't. That's not consciousness. That's just neural activity that's taking place. And that's another thing, by the way, Tim. In the 1980s, again, there was a guy. I have his book here. 1 second. This is a book. One of the books that my mum gave me. My mum bought me 3 books in my lifetime, and this was one of the books. See this book here?
Lifetime.
I don't know if you know of the book, but Lyle Watson. He wrote a number of different books called Lifetime. This guy, when I was a young, I forget what age I might have been. I was in my teens, but he was on a program that we have here in Ireland. You have something similar to it in the US, but it was called The Late Late Show. You guys had The Late Show. But we had The Late Late Show by a guy called Gay Byrne. And I remember Lyle Watson came on to The Late Late Show. And I was fascinated by him. I mean, really fascinated by him. And I've read a number of his books, but this is my favorite book. And Lyle Watson was talking about experiments that were carried out in the 80s, and these these were surgical experimentations on humans. Now they had done obviously work with regards to primates and mice, etc. But this was for people who were suffering really serious epileptic seizures, and so you have this portion right in the center of your brain. So you have a right and left cerebral cortex. We don't know why we have a right and left cerebral cortex. Why do we not just have one large, massive brain? Again, from an evolutionary viewpoint, you have dolphins who are hemispheric. In other words, dolphins can go asleep and with one portion of the brain asleep and the other portion of the brain awake, so that they can keep one eye on the world. Birds do something similar. So birds are able to peck and eat, but keep an eye on the world as well, or they can go asleep, but keep an eye out for danger. So there is perhaps a benefit in kind of dividing up the workload. And perhaps that's why we have a left and a right hemisphere. But again, this is just conjecture. It's hypotheses, but we can't be sure. Nobody gave us a handbook on the brain. But we do have a right and a left side of the brain. It's really fascinating. I find this part fascinating. So what they did was, you have this large portion of the brain with this large body in the center of the brain. And you have fibers which run from one side to the other. This is called the corpus callosum. Now you have fibers that run from front to back in the cerebral cortex, but you have fibers that run across. So we call these commissures. And so they literally have to open up the brain. So they have to lift off the calvarium, they have to lift off the cap. And then they take a large knife and they have to slice through the corpus callosum. Imagine doing that. I mean, you'd have been scared out of your wits doing something like that, in the hope that this would, rectify the epileptic seizures. Now, what they discovered over years as well is that if you did not cut the entire corpus callosum, if you left a few fibers in place, well, then the electrical activity would simply move to that portion of the corpus callosum and would move across, and people would still have epileptic seizures. So they made a full incision. And then, of course, they put back the dura mater, they put back the cap, and bring the scalp back over the head, and they give these people an opportunity to recover. And when they recovered, lo and behold, they seemed to be doing brilliant. They seemed to be really good, and they didn't have epileptic seizures. Wow. So then they started saying, well, look, we have to do some investigations to see, what exactly is going on. So now you have to trust that what I'm going to do with my face, Tim, is exactly what they did. So what they did was they brought the people in, they had a little box in front of them, and they had a little green light on one portion of the box. But what they did was they covered the left eye. Now, why is that important? Because once again, from an evolutionary viewpoint, information that comes in from your left eye goes to the right cerebral hemisphere. And information from the right eye goes to the left cerebral hemisphere. Now, it's a little bit more complicated than that, by the way, because you actually share information to both sides of the brain, but predominantly right eye to the left side, left eye to the right side. And then there are some other quirky bits of kind of evolutionary realities. We have speech in this part of our brain, which is the left part of our brain. We have Wernicke's area, and we have Broderick's area here to the front. And so this is all about to do with speech. The right side of your brain really doesn't command vocabulary. It can't speak. It can understand language, but it can't actually verbalize for you. That's the left side. Now, that's for people who are right-handed. Left-handed people are incredible. They're incredibly interesting. But so roughly 10% of the world is left-handed and always has been. You might see some slightly different figures up to saying 15%, but 10% of the world are left-handed. At that other 5%, they can be ambidextrous. In other words, they're left and right-handed. But left-handed people are interesting from a neural viewpoint to study. But why are 90% of the world right-handed? We don't really know. We don't. Again, we've hypotheses, but we don't know why Are you right-handed or left-handed?
I'm right-handed.
Right-handed. So 90% of the world are right-handed, and that's just the fact. So okay, what happens? So we've got a box in front. We have covered the left eye, so that we've covered the right eye, so that the left side of the brain cannot see. Yes, so it's the right eye. So the left. This is where language is. Hope I got that right. Yeah. So right eye, left side. So that's accurate. Okay. So they cover that and they show the green light. Now afterwards, they say to the patient, what did you see? And they say, I saw nothing. And they say, did you not see a green light? And they say, no, I didn't see a green light. And then they do this, watch. No, I didn't see a green light. And the researchers were flabbergasted by that. Have to take a drink. So they do it again, flash the green light. And they say, did you see anything? No, I didn't see anything. Did you not see a green light? No, there was no green light. Now they were flabbergasted, as I say, by this. What they discovered is that the right side of the brain, which cannot deliver vocabulary, it can't produce words, the right side of the brain saw the green light and could hear you saying, no, there was no green light, and therefore went as if they were disgusted with you. They were disappointed with you. They were saying, of course you've seen the green light. That's why they went, rolled the eyes to heaven and did. So in effect, what you have two people inside your brain. And it's funny how you hear people saying things like, oh, I've got this guy on this shoulder and I have this guy on this shoulder. And he says, go on, do it. Go on, do it. And this guy says, don't you dare attempt to do that. And this guy says, no, go on. You'll have great fun. You can do it. And people often talk about, those two little angels, the little devil and the little, the good angel. And then, of course, when things go wrong, we have people who are schizophrenic and they have multiple personalities. So there are actually scientists who believe that there are two personalities in every person, that there are a minimum of two people in every person. Isn't that amazing?
Yes.
So that's kind of one little story in terms of, us understanding brain and brain activity. But the idea that there are people who are also, by the way, can be born with only one hemisphere. So they don't have two hemispheres. They could be born without the right, and it's typically the right side. So these individuals can still talk and verbalize, and they look perfectly normal. And they tend to live pretty normal lives. So that's kind of an interesting aspect of just neural activity or brain activity. So now where do I want to go with this? So I mentioned earlier about emerging property, yes? And I teach anatomy from the viewpoint of something called tensegrity. So I'm going to go back then to Ian McGilchrist and the master in his emissary. He was talking in his book, and he was saying that if we were observing a river over time, we would see that the river was restlessly and relentlessly searching out its path across the landscape. But the reality is that there's no activity taking place, no activity in the sense that there's no will involved, there's no decision-making on behalf of the water, or there's no decision-making on behalf of the landscape. So one can see the landscape as blocking the path of the water, so that the water then has to turn right or left, has to go one way or another based on the landscape giving way. In other words, erosion. But again, the water is simply, flowing in the way that water has to flow, and the landscape is simply offering opposition in the way that the landscape has to offer opposition. And the result of what we would call amorphous water, in other words, water takes up the shape of the container that is holding it, will constitute a river. So a river doesn't exist because it encounters the landscape. The landscape, does not and cannot make a river. It simply resists erosion, which is the effect over time. So space and time. So effect over time, so that the water overcomes the landscape and it moves in the direction of least resistance. So the river emerges as a consequence of this kind of unconscious interplay. Of course, the river, emerges as a consequence of meeting, this resistance. So, and it becomes an emerging thing, an emerging property. So water will never be a river, and the landscape, as I say, can never make a river. The water just needs to meander in the way that it does, and it forms into a river. And we see that being reflected in the human body in terms of vascularity. Mother Nature has a way of just repeating herself. If you're ever in an airplane and you look down, from 40,000 feet, 36,000 feet, and you'll see a river, and it really looks like the inner workings of your lungs, or the the arterial or venal system that you have in the human body. So that's ultimately what I think. I think consciousness is a facility, or a utility that gives you sensation, a feeling. It allows you to witness an event, but it has little to do with perception. Perception is another unbelievable conversation, because perceiving is not necessarily that you're seeing reality. You may not be seeing reality at all.
So does consciousness live in the brain, or does consciousness create the brain or everything else? Like I interviewed a friend of yours. He's an embryologist. I can't remember his name right now. And he talks about that our soul starts creating our body, but the soul is what creates the body versus the body creating the soul. Anyway, and I may be crossing streams here, like on Ghostbusters.
No, you're talking about Jaap van der Waal.
Yes.
Yeah. And so, I've had conversations with Jaap on many occasions where, I think people have the right, based upon, historical evidence where we currently are, to be able to come up with a hypothesis. This takes us then into the conversation about abortion. In other words, when does a human being, first emerge? So there are some people who would say that it's okay that they would support abortion because it's just a clump of cells. So Jaap, as you mentioned, would have a different opinion on that. Jaap would have a different opinion. So you have a sperm, which is a half cell. You have the oocyte, which is a half cell, and then they combine together to create a cell. And then some people talk about cell division. You see, and we would have a difference of opinion there. We would see it as a cell multiplication as opposed to cells dividing. So the oocyte, which has an outer covering called the zona pellucida, it does not increase in size, but you start getting this multiplication of cells. And so space now becomes a big issue. Because these cells are pressing against each other. And this leads to what we call closest packing in tensegrity principles. And so suddenly all of these cells, which are pluripotent cells, they're all stem cells. Every cell is exactly the same as the other cells. They're undifferentiated. But yet there's a kind of a spark in the engine, as someone has said in the past. And suddenly, things start to differentiate. So that then takes us into a conversation about genetics and epigenetics. You're also, I suppose, stepping on the territory of the panpsychics. I don't know if you've heard of panpsychics, but so there are. So I've got a gardener in today, by the way, so they're outside now doing their. We might hear that from time to time. So I've spent most of my adult life. I think I've been judicial about investigating these type of questions, exploring the complexities of human life. And that's exactly what we are. We're complex and we are random. And it's very, very hard to be able to, replicate a computerized system that can reflect complexity and randomness. I mean, you can get it, but I think this is kind of what happens. And there's a great book, by the way, that's going to come out in May on complexity, written by I've mentioned him to you before. I thought maybe he'd be a great guy for you to have a conversation with, certainly before May, before his book comes out. And that's Dr. Neil Thies. Neil is in New York University. He specializes in confocal microscopy. He's a pathologist, but he has a beautiful book written, Notes on Complexity. So I really recommend it to anybody. And I think he'd be a great person for you to have a chat with. But one way or the other, I've come to realize that, and I would describe a kind of a mutualistic relationship with our home, on the earth, and how this relationship supports the idea that Earth, and by association, the cosmos, is fine-tuned for life, that everything is connected. So I'm going to kind of head back to the initial question in a moment. So we'll say physics tries to resolve the question of what matter is. Metaphysics speaks to the question of what exists. So people of a rational kind of scientific bent, they kind of, they might think that there's a coextension, that everything is physical, and others see that there's kind of a unifying theory to bring it all together. The panpsychics, for example, they would be of the opinion that even the smallest particles have some level of consciousness within them. So this is another thing I say to my students when I'm in class. Let's go with a muscle fiber example as an example. And I think I may have said this to you before, but in a different conversation or a different context. You take a muscle fiber, and let's say we hold a muscle fiber within our finger. So a typical muscle fiber in the human body would be 1/10 the diameter of a hair on your head. So you can fit about 10 muscle fibers into, that space. We look at a muscle fiber and we ask ourselves the question, does a muscle fiber exist? Is it real? And you say, yes, of course it's real. And say, well, if it's real, it must be made of something. Does that sound reasonable?
Sure.
Okay. So if we say it's made of something, and then we invent some piece of equipment to kind of take a look at it. So the microscope was invented, and we look at this. Now, of course, we're in the 21st century, so we now have some incredible equipment to look at things in a way that we couldn't look at before. I mentioned confocal microscopy with Neil Thies. So we look at the muscle fiber and we say, look, muscle fibers are made of smaller fibers. Let's give them a name, myofibrils. Okay. Let's look at the myofibril. Does a myofibril exist? And you say, yeah, myofibrils exist. There they are. You say, okay, well, if a myofibril exists, then it must be made of something. Oh, wow, okay. Well, let's take a look at the myofibril and see what's inside. So we look inside a myofibril and we see that there are smaller little fibers inside. Let's give them a name. Let's call them myofilaments. Okay. Do myofilaments exist? Yes, they exist. There they are. We can see them under the microscope. Okay. What are myofilaments made of? Well, let's have a little look inside and see if we can see. So we look inside and we see there are several different things constituting, making up the myofilament. Let's take one of them. Let's take actin. It's a protein, see? And we say, well, does actin exist? And we say, yes, it does exist. And say, well, then it must be made of something. Say, yeah, let's take a look and see what it's made of. So we look at it and we see it's made of monomeres. And we say, wow, do monomeres exist? And we say, yeah. Wow, they must be made of something. Well, what are they made of? Well, they're made of G and H proteins. G and H, do they exist? Yeah. Let's take a look inside them and see what they're made of. And you have to ask yourself the question, well, hang on a second. How far down this rabbit hole do we go? Do we reach a point where something is always made of something else? Or do we reach a point where something is made of nothing? Okay, well, is that not reminiscent of the Big Bang Theory? Is that not a reflection of the outer cosmos? But now we're talking about the inner cosmos. We've gone inside a cell, muscle fiber, muscle cell, and we're going right into the nuclear aspect of the cell right now. And where do you go to? Some people feel you end at what's called the cosmic foam, and that there's no more fundamental material than the cosmic foam. Of course, you've heard of the Higgs boson. I'm sure you've heard of the Higgs boson. And the CERN collider, which is in Switzerland. It's funny how we have to build something that's incredibly big in order to be able to look at something that is infinitesimally small. And what do? Well, we get these particles in the collider, and we send them around this big tube and we smash them into each other, because the physicists were looking to see if there was something smaller than these small little particles. They were looking to see if there was this thing called the God particle. And sure enough, they collided these particles together and they broke into smaller particles. So they said, wow. So now we have these different like quarks and leptons, you see? And you say, wow, do leptons and quarks really exist? Yes, they do. But guess what? They must be made of something. And that's going to be the next step, is to try to investigate them and smash them together. I'm not a physicist, I'm a clinical anatomist, but I guess they're going to smash them together. And where does it all end? So that's where it all came from. I mean, it all came from these fundamental, if they are fundamental, these fundamental elements. But how does consciousness arise out of that? You know, these are not sentient, or at least there are people who would feel they're not. The panpsychics believe, though, that they are. The chair you're sitting on right now, Tim, they would believe that that has, you know, some level of consciousness. So you remember I kind of mentioned at the very beginning of our conversation that I was talking about Thomas Nagel, and he said, yeah, what is it like to be a bat? You know, if it feels like something to be a bat, then that thing has consciousness, you see? But the panpsychics would disagree with that. They would say that everything has just the smallest, infinitesimally small amount of consciousness. And then it's a matter of you know, building mass, and you reach a threshold, a point where you get enough of the mass together, and therefore you get different levels of consciousness. So you look at a pussycat, and a pussycat would have a very different level of consciousness compared to a mouse, or compared to you and me. And there are some people, in fact, who would believe that animals don't have any consciousness, and because of that, they don't experience pain. And therefore, it's, you know, so for instance, René Descartes, you've heard of René Descartes. Well, René Descartes, he practiced vivisection on animals. Now, you'd have to think to yourself, I would like to think that he didn't think that he was being that cruel to animals. because I believe that animals are conscious, and I believe that they do feel pain. But René Descartes didn't. René Descartes carried out vivisection on animals. Harvey, who's famous for describing the circulatory system, he would bring dogs into the auditorium, into what we call the theater. Of course, that's where you still get, if you're going in for an operation, you go into the operational theater. So we still use that word theater, but there would have been people in the tiered seats, and he would have had a dog with its legs, its front and behind legs, tied with ropes and splayed out to the side. And then he would have come in with a blade and he would slit them down the middle, and blood would have squirted out into the members of the front row of the audience. And of course, this is what it was theatrical. And this is what some anatomists did, and how they made money, because people paid to come in to see these things. And I'm assuming that, that people like Harvey did not think that that animals could feel pain.
So that's a whole other issue, because anybody that's ever accidentally shut a door on a cat's tail or accidentally stepped on a dog's foot would know that they feel pain.
No, well, you see, there are certain individuals, there are certain philosophers and physicists who would believe that that's no different to a wheel making a squeaky noise. In other words, that the wheel doesn't feel any pain, it has no consciousness, it just makes a noise because there is something wrong. It's energy leaking from the system. So when the cat goes, it's just a squeaky wheel. That's what they would say. This is where it comes down to evidence, you see, to say, well, where's the evidence that the cat is conscious? So you and I can have the discussion to say, well, look, I've seen the cat. I can look at my dog, and I can tell when my dog's a little bit depressed. That's a feeling. So feelings are consciousness. A computer can sound happy, and a computer can carry out tasks, as I said at the very beginning of the conversation. But I think we're fairly confident that a computer cannot feel satisfaction or joy. We could play around with that, actually. That's just, I don't know how we'll do that. Didn't think about doing that until this moment. Let's do it now. Hey, Siri. Hey, Siri.
Mm-hmm.
Are you there?
I'm here.
Do you think about things, or are you conscious?
Well, I'm soft-aware.
And what is software? Well, maybe she's gone. Hey, Siri, are you conscious?
Well, I'm soft-aware.
You're software. Do you have feelings? I don't know. If you've got a phone, you might do better. You might get a better result. Hey, Siri, do you have feelings?
I am beginning to understand a kaleidoscope of emotions just from observing humanity.
Wow. She's beginning to observe the kaleidoscope of emotions by observing humanity. I'm not quite sure, if that means that she's on the way to becoming conscious. Of course, there's rumors that that maybe some people have reached levels of consciousness with artificial intelligence. I don't know if it's true. It may well be. It may well be possible. I just don't know. I don't know whether it's it's not a purely humanistic, just belonging to the homogenesis, because as you said, you believe your cat is conscious. I believe all living constructs have conscious levels. So now am I starting to become a panpsychic? Maybe a little bit.
Well, okay. I mean, all right. So you brought up energy in the first part of the conversation too.
Yeah.
But is energy related to consciousness? Is it consciousness? Are they completely separate things?
Well, that's a great question, Tim. I'm not surprised that you're thinking in that way, because I'm thinking in that way as well. They're similar. I'm sure plenty of our listeners will say, hey, that's a question that I had. If we stop and we think about the evolution of life on Earth, at some stage, what happened was the bacteria that was living in these volatile seas on Earth somehow got together. And I'm probably not going to use the best analogies here, but these are my analogies. These bacteria got together, and one guy said, hey, hang a second, don't eat me. And the bacteria said, yeah, but I usually eat you. And he goes, yeah, but today don't eat me because I've got a plan. What's the plan? I'll hang around with you and you eat that other stuff over there. And then you kind of, you regurgitate or poop out this stuff. It's not the best analogy. But I can use that as energy, See the analogy? I'm going to eat your poop. It doesn't sound great, does it? But anyway, you get the idea. So they really, you can eat that stuff, yeah, and then I can make energy, and I can share the energy with you. Okay, brilliant. So now instead of being an adversary, you now become my partner and my comrade. And this is what happened, and we call these organelles. And so they got together, and somehow they put this protective sphere around them, which we call a plasma membrane, and we're not quite sure how a plasma membrane came about. And that's the difference between ourselves and plants. We have this, in embryology, we have this outer, covering, the zona pellucida, but cells have this outer covering, this plasma membrane. And inside the cell, you have these organelles. And all of the organelles, from the same etymology as organization, all these members of the cell, they all carry out different functions and provide, energy to the cell, but the most important one is the mitochondrion. And the funny thing is, when they did the Human Genome Project, they confirmed, to great extent, science, you see, is never about proving anything. You can't prove anything with science. And if anybody says to you it's been proven, they're really using the wrong vocabulary. That's the wrong vernacular in science. Science is a little bit like going into a courtroom. You have two sides. You've got the plaintiff and you have the defendant, and then you have either a jury or a judge or both, of course. And what happens is both sides put their argument forward, and it is the jury or the judge or both who will say, well, these people have presented the best case, so we're going to believe these people. Well, we know that many a man and a woman have been sent to prison and have been sent to death, only to discover afterwards that, in fact, they were innocent. And maybe it's 30, 40, 50 years later, even sometimes hundreds of years later, that there's, new methods of investigating that then provide evidence to say, no, we can prove this person was innocent. So proof and, proving are two very different things. So science is never about, providing, unconditional proof, because in 20 years' time, we might discover that's a new set of explanations for what we thought was absolutely evident, you see. But it provides us evidence, and it's the best evidence that we have today. And then we can look back over a period of 20, 30, 40, 50 years and say, yeah, this seems to be repeating in the research, so we can feel confident about this particular fact. So we're back to where were we? I went into the court of law. We were talking about
we're energy and consciousness.
Energy, thing. Sure, energy and consciousness. So now basically the Genome Project, what the Genome Project has demonstrated to us as an absolute fact is that mitochondria are not human. So human beings do not have the ability to digest and metabolize sugars. So, well, then how do we do it? Well, you don't do it, mitochondria do it. Now, mitochondria are now part and parcel of who you are. But believe it or not, you are only 10% you. The rest of the 90% that makes up Tim Anderson is in fact mostly bacteria. And you have that bacteria, for instance, around your mouth. They're mostly called steps. You don't want to get them into your mouth. So in other words, do your best not to be sticking your fingers in your mouth and picking food out and whatever, because you've got bacteria on your hands and you're touching your face, and then by putting them into your mouth, those steps can get in and then they can cause you upper respiratory tract infections. So they're here for a reason. You've got bacteria on your hands. Neil Teese loves to talk about this one. You've got bacteria that live in the creases here on your joints. And what they do is they eat dead skin. Now, what do they poop? Well, they poop out an oil, which allows your skin to become lubricated, see, so that you can bend your fingers. So we have this symbiotic relationship with these bacteria. We have a symbiotic relationship, by the way, with every single living and non-living thing on this planet. When people say to me, well, where's the evidence for that? I say, well, think about your alveoli in your lungs. Your alveoli are full of this atmospheric air. So there's that continuity. If you look at your red blood cells have iron content in them. Well, where does iron come from? Iron comes from only one source, and that is a supernova, a collapsing star. It's the only place in the universe where iron can be generated, and yet you have it in your bloodstream. So I think that is really good evidence. The same for calciums in your bone and so on. You have the continuity of the cosmos inside your body, and you have mitochondria. And without mitochondria, we would not have the level of energy that we currently have. So I think that there's a relationship between energetics and mitochondria and the emerging property of consciousness in the human body. I think there's a correlation between those two things.
Yeah, I do too, especially like when you look at the interconnectedness, like you just talked about, like where everything's a relationship. And without one part of that, none of it works.
Exactly.
And to me, that's like some kind of, I don't know, that's weird, but to me, that almost screams consciousness versus, that it's just a thing that the brain manufactures almost.
Yeah, but I mean, it's a weird thing as far as I mentioned earlier on. If you take the thalamic activating system and you damage that, well, then consciousness is gone. When you fall asleep at night and you go into what we call rapid eye movement, in other words, you go into deep sleep, consciousness is gone. It's like a mini death.
But is it gone, or is it no longer able to be transmitted from the person, from the receiver? Like is the brain also just an antenna that pulls out Wi-Fi signals out of the air that you can't see, that you don't know it's there, but it's always there? Like radio waves are always there. We have no way to detect them unless we build something that detects them.
Well, a radio, a small little. I was doing that with the students at the weekend. I don't know if I have that particular bag with me. No, I don't have. I bring in a tiny little transistor. I bought it at a kid's store, but I pulled the aerial up and then I turn it on and we hear the move the dial and it picks up, we start dancing because some cool music, and I'm talking to them about invisible forces. I sometimes use my I did this at nighttime because it was just kind of nice and effective in the dark, and I was down by the sea, and I put the my fob. I did this with the fob of my car, and you see the orange lights much further down the road, but they do this. You see, the odd thing about that, by the way, and here's a nice little experiment for you. Walk away from your car with your fob, and point your fob at the car at a distance where it won't work. In other words, you've just gone too far. And then put the fob to your head and press the fob and your car will light up. Okay. In other words,
so maybe the brain is an antenna.
Yeah. So it's the brain. The brain is a lovely conduit. So it's nice and wet and fluidic, and it really facilitates the sending of the signals. But of course, the signals, you don't have to point the fob at your car because the signals are going out in every conceivable direction, and it'll pick and pick it up. But just to get my head around what you're asking, let's go back to this again then. So yeah, I mean, what the physicists and what scientists will tell us is that when you are sleeping, there is no consciousness. In other words, a person wakes up and can't remember any particular experience. If they had a dream, they'll remember the dream. And sometimes, by the way, people mix up their dreams with reality. They might meet somebody and say, "Oh yeah, how are you doing since Tuesday?" You go, "What do you mean Tuesday?" "Well, didn't we have a cup of coffee on Tuesday?" And you go, "No, we hadn't seen you in weeks." "No, we had a coffee on Tuesday." You had a dream that you had a coffee on Tuesday, and you really believe it until you meet the other person and say, "No, Josh, I've been out of the country." Something like that. And then you go, "Well, then I couldn't have had a coffee with you on Tuesday." It's not that you're making a mistake. There could be some really good conclusive evidence to say, "No, I definitely wasn't here on Tuesday." So that's I think is a pretty. But what are you saying then in opposition to that, or as an alternative to that?
I guess I'm not really saying anything as much as there seems to me that there's also still a wonder or an awesomeness that we just can't quite explain. Especially like but we can get glimpses of it, like the interrelated connectedness of every single thing that there is. Like, so you were talking about the bacteria that's on our skin, and it has a
Yes.
purpose, and without it, well, or without mitochondria, we wouldn't even be here. But it's part of us, but it's not us, but it's part of us. And just like without ants, we wouldn't be here, because
Absolutely.
they have a function in this world. And so like everything matters. And I don't know, I even think the earth is like, I think the earth's alive. Like when there's a storm or something, what if it's an immune response? What if it's like everything's related?
Well, that would be now part of the panpsychic explanation. They would say Gaia is a living, breathing entity, and this is what I was saying to you at the very beginning, that when I started out in my journey with my first degree and so on, and I have a number of degrees now, but I was really encouraged not to have those conversations. In fact, if anybody in neuroscience was to go into consciousness, you could really lose your career. You could lose your job in the university. So people were a little bit afraid to talk about this idea of consciousness. Now, that also then takes us into, so for instance, as a clinical anatomist, I work a lot with surgeons. And there are surgeons, I won't go into names as to who they are, but if any of them are listening to this now, they'll recognize themselves. One of my colleagues is a specialist in prolapses. And he was in surgery one day with a colleague of his, and he said to the patient's vitals dropped. And he said to the anesthetist, "What are you doing up there that you don't normally do?" And he said, "I'm doing nothing." He said, "What are you doing down there that you don't normally do?" And this guy said, "Oh, no, everything's cool. I'm not doing anything different." And so they medicated the patient and stabilized her and so on. And so the next day, my colleague was doing his rounds in the hospital and came up to this patient and said, "So how are you getting on?" And she said, "Yeah, everything's okay." She said, "But I'm just a little bit, sad today. I'm a bit down." And he said, "Why?" And she said, "Oh, my twin sister passed away yesterday." And of course, that hit him like a ton of bricks. And he, I'm not going to verbalize it correctly because obviously he was sensitive to the situation, but he said, "Would you mind if I ask, like, what time did your sister pass?" And she said, "Oh, 2:15." And that was exactly the time that her stats dropped. So my colleague would say, this is his saying, not mine. He says, "Well, actually, sometimes I've used this same description." He goes, "I'm not that guy." In other words, he doesn't believe in the stuff. What he's doing is he's simply recounting the story. I've got other colleagues of mine who are surgeons, and they do things like they put books like the Bible, and they put them into the architraving. There might be some fancy architraving in the surgical theater. And they've had people say to them, "Oh, I had an out-of-body experience. Oh, and by the way, I seen you have a book, on top of this architraving here." And they're saying, "Well, how would they have known that?" And I really don't know. I haven't got the answers. All I'm doing, I suppose, in that regard is I'm recounting the stories from people that I would say are very intelligent people. I don't believe they're making the story up. I don't believe, as we call them over here on this side of the world, porky pies, rhymes with lies. I don't think they're telling porky pies. I find it hard to believe it, but you see, I'm so institutionalized. I mentioned James Oshman at the beginning in energy medicine. So, now I love James' work and I love his book, but I would have been encouraged in my early years to think that individuals like that were quacks. But that's not true at all. And in fact, it's ignorant to think that way. It really is ignorant to think that way. And so I demonstrate to students in my classes, we might do this another day. I was in Waterford in the southeast of Ireland here over the weekend teaching. And I got everybody in the class to hold hands. And I said, can you feel anything, of interest? And they're all saying, "No, not really." And, some people said, "Oh, I'm holding, Emma's hand, and her hand feels colder or hotter than mine." And I said, "Okay, but do you feel anything else? Do you feel an exchange of any level of energies?" And no, a new course of students. And I said, "What if I was able to convince you that you are exchanging enough energy to light a light bulb, and you're exchanging enough energy to light a light?" I said, "If I could demonstrate that to you, provide you evidence, would you be excited?" And they said, "Yeah." And I did it. I'll keep that for another day with you, because I have to have some something here and I don't have it. But I was able to show it to them, and they were mesmerized by that. Of course, everybody gets flabbergasted when I show that. And to me, I think that's great evidence. I think it's really strong evidence to show that you create a circuit and you're exchanging energy. And as Newton told us, for every action, there's an opposite and equal reaction. So that energy is being passed from you to your patient, from your patient back into you. But what is it? What's energy? You see, but we know that energy cannot be destroyed, can't be created. It's there, but it can be converted. It can be used for work. It can change things from one state to another state. And what is consciousness? Consciousness is a state. Correct or not?
Yeah.
I believe that those two things are intrinsically linked. We just need to, carry out further investigations so that we can begin to describe it and, bring a particular syntax, a particular rich vocabulary to it. And we've only started that conversation in the last maybe, 100 years or something like that. So, and I think in the next 100 years, I think we will have it solved. Yeah, I think we will.
This is awesome. It leads to so many other questions, but I've taken so much of your time.
I love our conversations, Tim.
I do too. These are so much fun for me. So thank you so much for doing this, and I would love to have you again if you ever want to dive further down.
Of course. No, we'll have many more conversations. So this conversation, I think that's probably even just the first step, because we got to, get into talking about different species on the earth. I mean, butterflies have 17,000 lenses in their eyes. Wow. They see the world completely different to you and I. They smell the world through their feet. So, how do they perceive the world? What world? They're living in the same world as us, but yet they're not seeing things the way we see things. And I'll finish on this one as well, because I just, from an embryological viewpoint, I believe that the embryo forming actually goes through itself. And something that goes through itself is not on a 3-dimensional plane, but on a 4-dimensional plane. So it's an additional plane. And I believe that to be the case. I believe that embryology occurs on an extra dimension. So you can't go through yourself now that you're formed. But in order to form you do go through yourself. And so you develop the perfect, infinite, Mobius loop or Klein bottle, whatever description you wish to use. And we need more evidence to be able to support that. But I do have evidence to support that. I've got some visual evidence as well, because we've now captured the developing embryo using technology that just wasn't available several years ago. So one of my colleagues, Jan van Eycken, you can go to janvaneycken.com, and he has a beautiful video on embryo development called Becoming. And it's just a magnificent piece of film. And this is one of the great things where, my early years, people would have said, oh, you're crazy or you're silly having those ideas. Where's your evidence? And in those years, in the 70s and the 80s and even in the 90s, we just didn't have the evidence. But now we have new equipment. We've got fiber optics. We've got light technology. We've got all of these new ways, fMRIs and CAT scans and PET scans. You've got the James Webb telescope up there in space, a million miles away from Earth, and we still can't see the furthest reaches of our universe. Like where does the universe end? And then that takes us into infinity. And then somebody says, well, what if you multiply infinity by 2? What? You can do that? Mathematically, you can multiply it by 2. So hang on a second. That's 2 times infinity. It's these ideas, are just, they'll blow your mind. But I love them. I love these kind of conversations.
Yeah, it's so much fun.
I hope you had fun. I hope the listeners, whoever was listening, I hope you had fun, as much fun as we had.
And if nothing else, I hope you learned that you're made from the same things that the stars are made from. Because
absolutely, and
you pointed that out.
Yeah, beautiful way to end, Tim, to say that you are connected. I often get students just to do this with their hand in the room. And I say, could you feel something against your skin? And they say, yes. I say, well, that's the molecules. In other words, this room is chock full of stuff. You think it's predominantly empty. It's not. It's actually predominantly full. and you're breathing that in. You are related, you're connected to every single living and non-living thing on this planet. And we need to get our head around that. And hopefully it's not too late. But I have great faith in the younger people growing up. I watch my own two daughters. I just think they're magnificent, and their friends are brilliant. They're bright. They're far cleverer than I ever was. They're more sensible than I ever was. So I've great, great faith in them for the future,
Right on. John, this has been so much fun. Thank you for being on the show.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Now get outside and play.